So we have already started the Spring Security in the last session. We have seen that basic authentication and what is the need of Spring Security, how simple it is to use Spring Security in our Spring Boot project. Cool. So today we are going to discuss in much more detail about that Spring Security and how we can utilize this authentication authorization technique. And in very much simple manner, we are going to use in our Spring Boot. Initial days, or if compared to the previous batch, what we used to do, we just try to manage our Springs, that means authentication and authorization things manually. And it was quite a pain to just manage those things, to create a UUID, and based on the ID, we need to create the login module, and then after check that each request is coming or not with our proper UUID code, and then after we just log out after that log out, we delete that UID code, and it was quite manual process. I request Zakir to share that video. I guess, do you have those videos? Manually using that authentication process in our Spring Boot project. Do you have, please confirm? Okay, so I will tell Zakir to share those videos also in today's lecture itself as extra video notes. So that lecture actually that was taken by me itself, and that video, it is, I guess it will be for 1.5 hour video. You can go through that. You'll get some more idea कि हम अगर Spring Security use ना करें, अगर तो Spring Boot में हम manually कैसे security को impose कर सकते हैं. So in that video, you will see there lots of other technique we have used, the manual effort we have used, and it was not industry standard. It was not 100% security proof. Lots of flaws are there in that. But किसी तरह काम चलाओ करके हमने login and logout video we have created. Zakir is saying, okay, he will share that video. So Zakir, please share those videos. So with that video, they will understand that without applying the Spring Security module, manually how we can impose or put the security in our Spring Boot project. Okay, but since the Spring Security is there, in Spring Security, all the security flaws and was removed, and you can say that it is a standard standard module for a Spring or Java based Spring based our REST API creation, where we have to use this Spring Security module. And in that module, almost everything is clubbed together, like lots of other security breaches, security vulnerabilities, it is addressed properly, and it's a standard one, industry standard. So right now in the industry also, they are using the Spring Security module, and it's a very, very important, very, very interesting topic as well, in which we are going to discuss in much more detail about the other concept like CSRF attack. Then after course configuration, what is the course origin? Then after we will discuss about what is the JWT token, authorization, authentication, all those things in much more detail. Okay, so let's quickly start that. Let me share my screen first. And we have already discussed about some basic concept of the Spring Security, and we have applied. But anyhow, we are going to start from the very beginning. And again, we are going to see some other basic rules also for the security. Okay, let me stop my sharing here video so that we can concentrate on our main topic. Some people are complaining about the side view. Zakir, please check out that. Is it my view is okay or not?
Is it right now, guys? Is it okay or not?
Yeah, it's okay now. Good. Okay, so let's quickly go through that, what we have done in last class, and what is the authentication, what is the authorization. So I hope that this notes, it is already shared with you and you have gone through these notes. Please confirm. Cool. So what is the security? Basically, security is what protecting our data and business logic inside our application, and it is a non-functional requirement. What is the meaning of non-functional requirement? किसी भी project में दो तरह की requirement होती है. There is a one functional requirement. That means what is your real business logic, or what are the real business functionality? What type of, you can say that your UI pages will be there, which type of transaction management you are using, what are the core business logic you have. That is called functional requirement, exactly what your application is doing. But as far as that, this is not sufficient to make an application perfect. You need to use some non-functional requirement as well. For example, security is one of the non-functional requirements. You can say that last class we have learned that logging. Logging is also not a functional requirement. It is a non-functional requirement. To log message को generate करना so that we can trace our application flow, we can track our application or request or all those things. It is also comes under non-technical, non-functional requirement only. Similarly, scalability, performance, availability, logging, these are also called non-functional requirement. It is no way related with our core business logic. What are the security fundamentals in any system? That is your some resources. In our case, it is REST API, or let's say that web application database in a or you can say that any kind of resource you are procuring in a cloud. So we have some this kind of resources we have. हमारे resource होंगे क्या क्या? हमारी API होगी, हमारा application होगा, which is having some web pages. Our database is also one type of resource. Some resource might be you have procured in the cloud as well. And then after what is that, we have some identities. Identity is basically what need to access the resource to perform the action. What type of identity we have, whether we have the proper privilege to execute that particular functionality, whether we are the right person to call this API. So those things is called identity, whether we are the right candidate, right person to call those APIs or call those or access this particular application or not. Okay, these are the some security important principles. I request everyone to just go through some of the theory part is there, so I don't want to spend too much time over this. So because what is that? What is some security principle we have, like trust nothing. If you are exposing the security in your application, first of all, everything should be what you have to just the first principle is trust nothing. That means do not trust anything. Anyone, even a single route or single thing if user want from your application, first of all, he has to be authenticated. Right? Just like that, you are hiring a security guard in front of your apartment. So anybody will come, whether he is whatever the person he is, he has to show his identity proof. Then only he is allowed to enter into the premises. So validate every request, whatever request is coming, even for the non-valid request also. Let's say that in our REST API, we have 5 routes are there or 5 endpoints are there. Maybe some person is trying to access the API which is not available. Still, I will not going to give him the permission. Whether this endpoint is there or not, if you are just coming to my application, you have to first authenticate yourself. So validate piece of data information that comes into the system. Assign list privileges. That means we have some certain layer of that, our privileges like that. Start the design of system with the security requirement in mind, have a clear picture of user role and access, which type of user is allowed to create a data, update a data, delete a data record. Let's say that you have some CRUD operation related requirement or APIs you have created. So you should not allow that to anybody can come and delete the record or update the record like that. Anybody can see your records, anybody can see your data, anybody can post some data as well. But only the authenticated people or authorized people with the proper privileges, he is only should be accessible. Those endpoints which is deleting the record or updating the record. Then assign the minimum privileges at every level, like application level. Some security we impose on an infrastructure level as well. Let's say that your database also we have the some user and password. You can apply the databases user and password on the servers as well. You're not on your cloud. If you're procuring those resources, you can put that on a cloud as well. So multiple level, you have to impose your security. Have complete mediation. That means everyone has to pass through the main gate. Test the role and access for each user. Have depends in depth. Multiple secure level of security should be there. That means in a transport layer, in a network layer, infrastructure layer, application layer, OS layer, multiple layer of security should be there. Of course, there should be what it should not be like that कि हमारी सारी investment या जो भी हमारे application design के cost है वो सब security पे ही हम expense कर दें. No, we should have consider this thing also. That means economy of mechanism, and it should not be was too much difficult, and it should be very much simple like that कि हम security break करने में ही या फिर हमें authorize authenticate करने में ही we have just allocating lots of resources is also not a good practice. It should be what have some mechanism, economy of mechanism. Okay, then after security architecture should be so simple. In this security of have economy of mechanism only it comes under. Then after ensure openness in design like that, you can see that here nowadays hackers are there, right? And security breaches are also there. Nowadays hackers are also evolving day by day. they are trying to figure out कि किस तरह system को break किया जाए. So our security should be what? Whenever our Spring security team is working continuously and everything will come, any flaws will coming and they are detecting, they definitely they are going to release a patch version or some other enhancement they are continuously doing. So our design should also follow what? Openness design, like that. So any kind of problem will come in the future, they can identify that flaws and they can quickly fix those flaws so that we have the robust, our application will be there. Different type of securities will be there, like that I told you that some of the infrastructure level security, like that we are putting some since it is an internal application, if it is have the internal application, so that we can put some firewall restriction, HTTPS, SSL, you might have used that in lots of time. What is this? Basically, it is an certificate to make sure that no one tampering our data when a client is sending the data and back to from the server. Authentication, authorization. So different type of security rules are there. You should apply there. Authentication and authorization. Basically, our Spring security is no way concerned. It is not going to manage this type of security, like your firewall type of security, or you can say that your SSL, HTTPS, this kind of security, it uses internally, but it will not impose on that. Basically, our Spring security revolve under these two categories, authentication and authorization. Okay, now the Spring security, basically, as I told that it is very much powerful and very much customizable, and it revolves under what? Authentication and authorization, and it can be used in a standalone web application, Spring MVC, REST application, or microservices. आप इसका use कहीं पे भी कर सकते हो. That means in a normal application also you can utilize. Most of the time it uses where Spring MVC and REST application, and as well as microservices. Extensively it is used in the microservices and REST API. But of course, in a Spring MVC type of web application, if you are creating where you have that JSP and other time-lift kind of web technologies are there. So there also Spring security is very much used. What is authentication? We have seen already that, first of all, you need to pass that your username credential, and then after authorization. So authentication should be first, then after you need to give your authorization. That means authentication says that who are you, and authorization says what you want. What permission do you have? Which type of, do you have this permission to call this API or not? To call this service, this permission you have or not? So authentication जब भी हमारा अगर fail होता है, we basically get that here 401 authorization is required, because basically it is an authentication. Don't confuse here कि sir ये तो authentication का part है, it should be it is not, or authentication should be required. No, 401 means basically comes under authentication when the authentication is failed, right? So, but here don't confuse with the name. Authorization required, but code is 401. That means your authentication is failed. You are not able to provide you the correct credential, or a system is not identifying your identity. And authorization 403, if you don't have the right permission. So if you don't have the right permission, you are the authenticated people, you are welcome into the system, but you don't have the right privileges to access or call certain APIs or call any access any services. So please keep in mind this error code 401 for authentication and 403 for authorization. So don't confuse with this authorization required. It is authentication only. And here for authorization, forbidden. 403 is the main, the status. That means here the description of this status code is forbidden. Okay. And we have already discussed that just you need to add this dependency, Spring Boot started security dependency in your pom.xml, and that's it. You have applied one security guard on your project, right? We have discussed this thing in our last example. So last example we have created there. Let me show you. Spring Security App 1. Let me just remove this configuration from here. And in the pom.xml, I have few dependencies are there. Let me just show that what are those dependencies. First dependency is your Spring Starter Web, so that we will get two things. One is the embedded Tomcat server and dispatcher servlet, so that we can generate or create the APIs, is dev tools for your hot module reloading. This is by default test, and this is the dependency Spring Security. Just once you have applied this dependency, then after we have created some endpoints in our application. So this is our my controller, And inside this controller, I have few endpoints. So what are those? So one is a hello one, another is a hello two. Two endpoints, which are the get mapping. This is the REST controller, and our application was ready. As soon as I will run the application, can you guess what will happen? Both the endpoints will be protected. Both the endpoints will be protected. Your security guard is applied on your project. And here on the console, you're going to see that one default password will be generated. So here the choosing the security password, one default password got generated. And now if I try to access any kind of routes like hello one, hello two, any kind of, just like I told you, that's the main gate should be there, right? If you want to enter into the system, first of all, you need to authenticate yourself. So if I try to call any kind of endpoint like hello one, so here it will be a sign up page. We need to pass the credential. Not only this, in fact, if you try to call hello one or hello two, or let's say that hello 5 or 10, any invalid URL also, you are going to land into this page. First, you need to authenticate, then only I will tell whether you have the correct accessibility to enter into the system or is this the correct API or not. So what is the username and password? The username should be user and password, which is your on the console. By default password got generated. Here it is. And now you'll be able to see that here, since I have used that hello 10, it was not there. So it is wrong URL. So now I need to give here what hello one. And here this time it is not asking any username and password. Now if I try to call hello two, so it will also work. So my application is working. The beauty is that here कि ये हमसे हर बार password नहीं मांग रहा है. I am calling once I get authenticated. Now it is not asking me the password again and again, right? We have to our username will by default user. Yes, by default, if you don't do any kind of configuration, so your default username that will be the user and password will be generated on your console, right? But of course, we cannot use this password because what will happen if you do any changes, your application will be deployed once again and you are going to get the different password. Username to same rahega, but password will be the different every time. Got it? For any changes, if you do that, your application will be restarted and you are going to see the different password once again, right? So we have the better option. What is that option? That is, we can configure our username and password inside this properties file. So it is, I'm just pasting it back. So spring.security.user.name aside and spring.security.user.password. You can configure your username and password inside this application.properties. And now, if I just restart my application once again, you will see that the default password will not generated on your console. So here you will not see any kind of password on your console because I have already mentioned that to my Spring Security, I'm going to give my own credential. So you will see that there is no any password got generated. And now if I try to open once again this page, so localhost hello one. This time it is asking you why, because my session was not out and basically it is working there. But if I close the browser and if I open the another browser, another tab, here we need to pass our credential. So let me just show you. So I'm going to open the another browser here. And this time I'm just using localhost colon 80/. This time here it is a login page where we need to give MSI and password is 1234. What the password I have given? 1234. And here we are able to access this or endpoint. Make sense? Okay. Now some person is asking, sir, this front end page created automatically. Yes, basically by default, this sign in page is created automatically. If you want to change, customize your sign in page, you have the option as well. You can customize your own sign in page for with your logo or your company related CSS and JavaScript or whatever you want. But Let's focus on the main functionality first. Then after we will see that those extra things, how to customize these things. Okay, cool. So, but the beauty is what for the Spring security, once we got authenticated, एक बार हम authenticate हो गए, let's say that if I'm calling hello one once again, it will not ask me the username and password again and again. If I just try to call that another one, same thing is working. How this is working through that? So here in that your notes, all those things, details is mentioned there. So here, how to change that username and password is also mentioned. If you create that, so by default, it's the username, password will be generated on the console. We can configure our username and password as well, right? Yes, of course, Ritik. Basically, what you can do here what logout as well. If I just call logout, there will be an extra route for you. Logout. Logout के लिए हमने कोई endpoint नहीं बनाया है. It is by default endpoint given by the Spring Security. If you call the logout, it is asking, yes, I want to log out. Now I can, this time, since I logged out, if I try to call hello one, now I'm landing onto the sign-in page itself. I'm not able to call any endpoint. So again, we need to authenticate ourselves. And now we're accessing that particular resource. And here, since I'm trying to call any other, since I'm logged in, I can call any type of endpoint. Cool. So till this point, I hope everyone is comfortable. But the thing is that how this magic is working. एक बार ये हमसे यूजर नेम पासवर्ड मांग लेने के बाद हमारे अगले रिक्वेस्ट के बार बार ये फिर हमसे यूजर नेम पासवर्ड क्यों नहीं मांग रहा है? Because basically what's happening here, where I'm typing this endpoint here, that is our URL I'm typing. This is basically in the browser URL and it is firing one HTTP request. And we already know that HTTP is stateless protocol. Stateless protocol मतलब कि जैसे इसके request गया यहाँ से और इसका response मिल गया, then it will forget everything from the previous request. The previous configuration will be lost. Next request onwards, it will establish the fresh new connection on the HTTP protocol. This is the default stateless nature of HTTP. Then how it is remembering our authenticated person. This person got already authenticated. Don't ask again username and password for the second request. Based on what? One cookie. And that cookie is called JSession ID. Let me show that cookie to you quickly. So here, if you open that, your console, and there is your application tab. In the application tab, you will see that here is your cookie, and the cookie name is JSession ID, and this is the value. Recall, I have already given one idea about that HTTP protocol. What is the stateless and stateful nature of the HTTP? So cookie is session ID, and you can say that hidden form field, URL rewriting. These are some tricks by using that you can make your HTTP pages stateful. हम उसे पुराने चीजें याद करवा सकते हैं. I have given one analogy for Ghazni movie as well that day. How the Ghazni used to remember those conversations, right? So cookie is also one of the trick here. इससे हम क्या कर सकते हैं कि हम HTTP के प्रोटोकॉल को instead it is what, or by default the nature of the HTTP is what you're stateless, but still we can remember the previous conversation. Same trick is also used by your Spring Security. It is creating one cookie with the name JSession ID with some random value, and this random value is basically representing what? Authenticated user. So if I try to call any other request like HTTP hello one as well, the same cookie value will be there. Same cookie value will come again from the server to the browser and from browser to the server once again. और चूंकि ये एक ऑथेंटिकेटेड पीपल को रिप्रेजेंट कर रहा है ये कुकी, सो अगली बार जब ये रिक्वेस्ट फिर से जाएगा ये कुकी को लेते हुए सर्वर के पास, this cookie value will recognized by our Spring Security framework, and this cookie value it will check, yes, this cookie value represent the authenticated user. It won't ask the user and password again. Does it make sense? Yes, JSession ID is a cookie name. ये सबके सिस्टम का सेम रहेगा, but value will be different. Value will be different based on that. If you just manipulate this one, let's say that if I am just tampering this value, right? If I tampered this value, then after if I try to give any request, now see that what will happen? It is again redirecting me to the sign-in page. So it is that cookie is what? It was tampered. ये cookie हमारे authenticated user को represent नहीं कर रहा है. That's why it is saying that, hey, this kind of user is not authenticated. Please do what? Do the login once again. Right? Yes, due to that, your cookie is JSON ID only, your cookie ID value only, your browser is able to identify that this person is logged in. That means it is remembering the previous conversation and making your HTTP protocol as stateful. Make sense? Cool. Now, if I try to just pass here any invalid username and invalid password once again, so you can see that this is another JSON ID is created. लेकिन ये JSON ID क्या authenticated user को represent कर रहा है या unauthenticated user को? Please confirm. This JSON ID is representing unauthenticated user. ये user logged in नहीं है, लेकिन एक बार जैसे ही हमने यहाँ पे अपना correct username pass किया यहाँ पे and password, now here you will notice this JSON ID is created. That means it is what authenticated person. Make sense? Okay, so we will talk about this JSON ID and the session-based authentication in much more detail, and we will see that the better approach as well. This JSON ID having some limitations, so anybody can take this JSON ID and they can do some requests, send some requests on behalf of users. So we have some better mechanism also. We are going to discuss that is our token-based authentication and authorization, that is JWT and some other tokens. Okay, but first of all, we should be very much familiar about the default nature of our user sign-in. Now, this is the whole thing about that, how our authentication is working based on our browser. But what will happen? From where to we should pass the username and password using Postman? Let's try to call this API using Postman. So I'm trying to call this API using Postman, that is hello one, and it should be the GET request. Now, if I try to call the send request, and you will see that here our authentication failed. I'm getting 401 unauthorized. Don't say that here, ki sir, ye to you should send that unauthenticated. No, it is a 401. That means unauthorized. Unauthorized means what? You are not authenticated, right? और अगर आपके पास authority fail है, जो कि हम बात करने वाले हैं थोड़ी देर बाद, कि हम authorization कैसे impose करते हैं, उस केस में 403 forbidden error आपको मिलेगा. So you need to just remember this status code as well. These are the very, very important status code. Okay, now from where we need to pass the username and password. In order to pass the username and password using Postman, you need to go to this authorization tab. You need to select this here, basic auth. And here in the username, you need to pass your username, that is Masai, and password 1234, like this. Now, if I try to call this endpoint, you will see that I'm able to access this endpoint properly. Now, the important thing, whenever you are passing this basic authentication and username password, here also you will see that the cookies values are there, JSON ID, and which is having some random value here. That means what? Now this same session ID will be just traversed across the another request. That means if I try to call that hello true from here, will it going to ask me the username and password? Because here it is already username and password is there. If I try to remove this one. Now, if I give the request, this time unauthorized, because what will happening here, the cookies are here, JSON ID will be the different with that username and password. Make sense? What I will do that, let me just go to the browser and this one, let me just steal this JSON ID, which is the authenticated JSON ID. From here, I'm copying this. Copy this JSON ID, and here I need to replace this one. This is JSON ID for authenticated users. Save this, and then I'm closing this. This time I will give the request once again. And here it is saying that unauthorized. Let me just maximize this version. Cool. It is saying that unauthorized, you need to pass the username and password. That means here what basically in previous version of Spring Security, even though you are not passing the correct username and password, but if you have the proper JSON ID, which is what authenticated, then you'll be able to allow to call this endpoint. even from the postman. But in the new Spring Security, it is no way. You have to pass the correct credential. Then only you are allowed to access this endpoint. So if I try to call any kind of endpoint, so basically it is what? Unauthorized. And if I, that means unauthenticated. And now if I try to steal that endpoint from my this session ID, which is logged in user, here it is. Let me try once. And paste it here. The cookies, session ID. Paste this. Save, close. No, it is not working here. Cookies values got, I guess, got tampered 15918C8. No, this session was not expired. This is working here, but since the domain is different, this cookie will not gonna work from the different domain. It will work only through this browser. It will not work from the other browser. Okay, cool. So basically, you need to pass that. If you want to call from the protected API from the postman, you need to go to the authorization. Actually, why it is not working, it will work. Basically, I just use the basic authentication. That's why it is not working. But if I steal that JSession ID, it should work. Let me just do one more time. It should work. Why it is not working? Because I just choose that basic authentication. I need to pass the username and password. But if I go to the previous one, this is the by default, and then I will steal that JSession ID. Right? Save this. This time it will work. Yeah, I'm able to call this endpoint. Right? Previously, why it was not working? Because I just choose in the authorization here as what basic auth. That time I have to pass the username and password. But the default is what? Inherit auth from your parent. That means here is the default one. If I just pass this one, and then I will be able to steal that authenticated JSession ID and I can access this endpoint. Make sense? Cool. But एक बार इसे हम अगर log out कर दें, so let me just do that log out from here. And do that logout. Now, can I call this endpoint from here as well? Guess what? Let's try to call this one. This time, that cookies was invalidated. The cookie value got invalidated. I'm not able to access that value once again. Okay, we are going to discuss about this nature in much more detail when we are going to discuss about the CSRF attack. What is a CSRF attack? That is the cross-site request forgery. It is a one kind of cross-site request forgery I have shown you. I have stolen that JSession ID, which was representing the authenticated user, and I just tampered that cookie's value from my postman, and then I was able to access that my protected API without passing the username and password from my postman. It is one kind of your cross-site request forgery. We are going to discuss in much more detail about that when we have a dedicated session on that, hopefully in tomorrow's session. Okay, so till this point, I hope everyone is very much comfortable how this authentication is working. Please confirm. Cool. And that's what the entire details is. Whatever is happening here is mentioned here is Spring Security. Remember my authentication based on this JSession ID. And here it will not ask the username and password again and again for another resource because it is tracking our authenticated user with the JSession ID. Here is ID value. From here, you can go there. And if you try to call the API using Postman, so how I have just used, you need to go to the authorization tab in your Postman, and then you need to select that authorization tab, and then you need to select that here, basic auth. And then you need to pass that your credential. That's what is mentioned. Okay, but the thing is that जब हम Postman से पास करते हैं ना, इसी तरीके से हमें दूसरे एप्लीकेशन से भी पास करना पड़ेगा. दूसरे application in the sense when you are trying to call this API from your front end, let's say that Angular or JavaScript or React. So that time also you need to pass that using this authorization header, and you need to pass the credential. अब वो हम कैसे पास करते हैं, उसके लिए हमें ये समझना पड़ेगा कि ये इंटरनली जब हम यहाँ पे ऑथराइजेशन टैब सेलेक्ट करते हैं, बेसिक ऑथ, और यहाँ पे हम जब यूजर नेम पास करते हैं ना, मसाई एंड 1 2 3 4, तो ये यूजर नेम एंड पासवर्ड जाता कैसे है रिक्वेस्ट के साथ. So this username and password will go to the request by using this approach. That is, when we provide that username and password, internally our credential will be encoded as base64 encoded form. So there is a one encoder called type of base64. इस form में ये encode हो जाता है, appended into the request header, as header name will be authorization, and that will be the basic and then base64 encoded. That in that format only the value will go. So let me just paste this one. This will be the username and password, and header का नाम क्या होगा, authorization. That will be the header name, and this will be the header value. Now let's discuss about this one. This is the header name. Header, what is the header? I hope everyone is aware with the request header. Request header में बहुत सारी चीजें हैं. Just recall our HTTP request and response structure, where we have discussed in our Spring Boot, कि जब हम HTTP से कोई भी रिक्वेस्ट भेजते हैं, उस रिक्वेस्ट के साथ बहुत सारे डिटेल भी भेजते हैं. And that HTTP request is having 3 sections: initial request line, request header, and request body. Did you remember that? Request headers are the key value pair. Browser ka naam, content type, all those things are mentioned. So whenever you are passing this one through the application, username and password. So basically here one type of UI, so you can give the text box, you can pass the username, password. लेकिन internally request जाता कैसे? That request will go using this header. In this header, the value will go to your server. कैसे? The header name will be authorization, and value will be basic. There is a one word, space, and base64 encoded of your username colon password. जो भी आपका यूजरनेम होगा, कॉलन पासवर्ड होगा, उसके base64 encoded फॉर्म में उसे encode कर दिया जाएगा, और उस encoded string को बेसिक के साथ अपेंड करके हम ऑथराइजेशन हेडर से हम इस रिक्वेस्ट को भेजते हैं. सो ये मैं क्यों बता रहा हूं, क्योंकि कल को आप अपने एपीआई को कॉल करोगे आप जावास्क्रिप्ट से या फिर अपने एंगुलर से, फिर हम यूजर नेम पासवर्ड कहां से पास करेंगे. तो अगर आपने वैसे कॉल किया तो आई होप दैट यू हैव ऑलरेडी गॉन थ्रू माय वन सेशन आई हैव टेकन देयर, वेयर आई हैव मेंशन दैट हाउ टू connect your backend with the front end using JavaScript. Please confirm. Cool. In that session also I have mentioned. So basically, let's say that I want to log in with my JavaScript, right? I want to call any endpoint. So in that case, I can display one dialog box. एक फॉर्म पेज हम दिखा सकते हैं यूजर को, जहां पे यूजर क्या करे, अपना यूजर नेम पासवर्ड एंटर करे. लेट्स से दैट वन एंटर यूजर नेम एंड एंटर पासवर्ड. दोनों टेक्स्ट बॉक्स होंगे यहाँ पे, और यूजर नेम पासवर्ड जैसे हम एंटर करेंगे, we have some JavaScript logic, and when we'll do the submit, then JavaScript logic will take that value from this text box, username and password. दोनों वैल्यू को लेने के बाद, अपेंड करने के बाद, यहाँ पे हमारे पास JavaScript में एक फंक्शन होता है. We need to call those function. That function will generate one random string. That is the base64 encoded username password. उस स्ट्रिंग को बेसिक के साथ लगाने के बाद, ऑथराइजेशन हेडर के साथ, हम रिक्वेस्ट हम फायर कर देते हैं कहाँ पे, अपने बैकएंड सर्वर पे, and then we are able to get that our proper response using fetch API or whatever you can fire this request. I have already mentioned these things in that front-end connection, so please refer that video. That means how to pass that request. So basically this is the thing, how exactly it works. Make sense? Please confirm. कि आपको फ्रंट एंड से यूजर नेम पासवर्ड को कैसे भेजना है. आपको दोनों टेक्स्ट बॉक्स से यूजर नेम पासवर्ड को कलेक्ट करना है. Then after there is a one function in JavaScript which will convert that your username and password into the base64 version. That means one string will be converted, and that string you need to append using basic space, and that string you need to paste as a header value, and header name will be the authorization. Using that, in the header part you need to embed things, and then you can fire a request to call any protected API, you should get that response. It is already mentioned there. You can please refer that one in your that video. Okay. So that thing is happening behind the scene. So don't think like that here whenever just using this your authorization tab, username and password behind the scene, which is username and password converted. And it is mentioned in your notes as well. So that is the your header name, and this is the header value. Till this point, I hope everyone is comfortable. Please confirm. Cool. अब लास्ट क्लास में हमने बात किया था इस बारे में कि ये स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी इंप्लीमेंट कैसे किया गया है. Spring security is implemented based on this structure. That is what your Spring security is implemented based on the filters, filter chain. Filter chain. That means what is a filter? I have given the idea also in the last session. Filter is a one type of concept. That means you can intercept any request from your servlet. Not only the request, in fact, response also you can intercept. We'll discuss about this filter and how we can create a filter in our application as well in tomorrow's session. But for the time being, you need to understand कि ये पूरी की पूरी Spring security की कहानी filter से ही बनी हुई. So this not only single filter can have, we can have the multiple filters as well. एक से ज्यादा कई सारे filter हम impose कर सकते हैं. और ये सारे filter एक chain की तरह काम करते हैं. First this filter will be invoked, and then after next filter and सारे filter pass करने के बाद ही request हमारा dispatcher servlet के पास जाएगा, which will acting as a front controller. And then only your APIs will be called and remaining process will happen. When the response also came, that response also goes through the filter, then only this filter will allowed, and then only it will come back to the client. So on a bottom line, you need to remember that Spring security concept is implemented based on the servlet filters. How we can create a filter, how we can, here the filters is like that. These filters are very much flexible. You can put your filter also inside the chain. You can change the order of the filter as well. आप अपने filter को कहीं पे भी embed कर सकते हो. इस 3 नंबर पे, 4 नंबर पे, where you want, you can put those filters. How can we can do that? How we can write our filters? We'll see in much more detail when we are talking about the JWT. Okay, and these bunch of filters is known as filter chains, right? Okay, yes, the validation. We'll talk about this filter in much more detail. So Spring security executes a series of filters. Filter provides these features. What are those features? Like that authentication is the user valid or not. So we have some filters like basic authentication filter. ये एक हमारे पास already filter बना हुआ है Spring security के अंदर. इसका काम क्या है? Authentication को check करना. Authorization को check करना है कि इस user के पास proper privilege है या नहीं, right access है या नहीं. उसके लिए भी एक filter लगा हुआ है, authorization filter. कुछ और भी filter है हमारे पास, जैसे कि कॉर्स फिल्टर की जब हम किसी जावा स्क्रिप्ट के एजेक्स कॉल से हम करना चाहते हैं कॉल अपने एपीआई को, so by default that call should be stopped, and it will be stopped using the CORS feature. What is the CORS? We're going to discuss in much more detail about that. So CORS, there is a one kind of protection layer is there inside any backend application. It will prevent any JavaScript call directly. So to allow that call from your Angular or React or any kind of JavaScript, you need to do the CORS configuration inside in your Spring security. And there is a CORS filter which is responsible to verify कि आपने CORS configuration apply कर रखा है. What is a CORS? We will discuss in much more detail. For the timing, you should know that the CORS configuration without doing, you can't call your Ajax call or JavaScript call. And you can't, even though if you're passing that right call, that means username and password also, your by default browser will stop that call. So you should just watch that video in our front-end connectivity. You might have seen there कि हमने जितने भी हमारे controller है ना, उन controller पे हमने एक configuration लगा रखा है, and that is what CORS origin. If you just watch that application, so cross origin, and I have mentioned that origin is equal to star. इसका मतलब होता क्या है? ये टेम्परेरी सॉल्यूशन है कि हम किसी भी जावास्क्रिप्ट वी आर, इसका मतलब सिंपल है कि वी आर ओके विथ एनी काइंड ऑफ जावास्क्रिप्ट कॉल. Yes, it is a CORS policy only. So we are okay with any type of Ajax or JavaScript call. And if you don't do that one, by default, no any front-end technology like JavaScript can call any of your API. even though it is protected or not. अगर आपने स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी लगाया है या नहीं भी लगाया है, तब भी आप इस API को कॉल नहीं कर सकते हो. In order to allow that course origin, you need to specify that particular annotation which I have just used. That was a one type of temporary solution. But there is a one in a Spring Security, we have a proper solution for this course policy. Course का मतलब क्या है? Malicious website. Now next thing is that after the course filter, we have the CSRF filter. CSRF filter is also there. We have also dedicated session. We are going to discuss about that CSRF token much more detail. So CSRF का मतलब क्या होता है? Cross site request forgery. Cross site request forgery. That means a malicious website making use of previous authentication of our website. Just now I have done that one previously. कि हमने एक authentication JSession ID को चुरा के हमने क्या किया था? Postman से call कर दिया था without passing any username and password. That is a one type of example of CSRF attack. So we have a proper solution also in the CSRF how to handle that one. So even though some authentication JSession ID is there, but still nobody can call our API. So there is a one filter called CSRF filter. So default CSRF protection is enabled in our application. So by default, the default CSRF protection is enabled in our Spring Boot project for updating a request. That means if you're trying to call post and put request, then you are not allowed to call without configuring this CSRF. So CSRF कहता है कि ठीक है, हो सकता है कि कोई आपका malicious website है या फिर user है, they can take your JSession ID, they can steal your authenticated JSession ID and they can make a call. So I won't stop them. लेकिन ये किसके लिए? सिर्फ read value के लिए. That means he can read the data, he can call a get API, but he won't be allowed to call the post and put API, like updating the data or sending the data or posting some data. That type, my CSRF filter will stop them. How to configure this CSRF? We are going to discuss today itself. Okay, then after some other filters are also there, like login page, logout page. So there is a filter called logout filter. There is a one filter called login page generating filter, default logout page generating filter. These are the filters which is responsible to generate the login page, logout page kind of stuff. There is some other filters are also there, exception translation filter. This filters is what they basically handle all the exception handling logic. So जो हम जो लिखते थे ना exception handlers. So we need not write here for the security related exceptions. We have already some exception translation filters are there, which will, if you have any kind of exception generated for your authentication authorization, these filters are responsible to attach the status code 401, 403, or which type of problem is happening. So these are some filters, predefined filters, and which will enabled automatically once you just put that Spring Security in your project. अब ये फिल्टर का जो ऑर्डर होता है ये भी काफी इंपॉर्टेंट है. तो पहले कुछ फिल्टर हमारे कौन कौन काम करेंगे? बेसिक चेक फिल्टर. दैट मींस whether you are okay or not for your course policy, whether you are okay or not with the CSRF attack, your basically login page filter, logout page filter, these filters will be there. Then after authentication filter, authorization filters, these are the filters run on a proper order. ये सारे फिल्टर किसी ऑर्डर में एग्जीक्यूट होते हैं और सारे फिल्टर पास करने के बाद ही कंट्रोल विल गो टू द डिस्पैचर सर्वर. Okay, so till this point I hope everyone got the idea कि ये filters how much important in our Spring Security. Please confirm. Cool. अभी ये थोड़ा हम we need to take a small break and then after we are going to discuss about this Spring Security components, this diagram. And once you are comfortable with this diagram, this is the, you can say that heart of your Spring Security. एक बार आप ये डायग्राम से आप कंफर्टेबल हो गए ना, तो आपको स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी बहुत ही मजा आएगा काम करने में इसके, और सारे कंफ्यूजन आपके दूर हो जाएंगे कि स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी इंटरनली हमारा वर्क कैसे करता है. So we are going to spend some time on this diagram and we will discuss about each component in much more detail, and then you will feel very much comfortable to using our authentication, using databases, using customizing this authentication. You will be very much comfortable with authentication providers and all those details as well. What is the authentication object, security context? We are going to discuss in much more detail after a small break. So it is 9:54. We'll come back by 10. Right. Is it okay? Please confirm. Okay, welcome back. So I hope almost all of you have created at least one Spring Boot project and you have added the Spring security dependencies. Please confirm. And you have tested at least one or two API. Hello, am I audible? Cool. So before talking about this diagram, what I discussed is the super important diagram. Let me just create one other application. And we will discuss a little bit more about that application and some other details. Then after we come back to this Spring Security component related diagram. So for this, I have one application for you. Let me first create that application. Then after we'll come back to this, all those details, the theory part. So let me first create these endpoints in my controller. I have welcome controller is there. Let me just define this. So stop the server. I'm deleting this my controller. And I'm creating one another controller here. And the class name will be welcome controller. And let me copy this code from here. And it should control shift O, it will import all of them. So let's go through this controller. What are those? This is the welcome controller, the rest controller. We have some APIs. What are those? There is a one post mapping welcome. Okay. Then there is a one get mapping welcome P. That is welcome P. Some methods are there. Let's first talk about this post mapping welcome. It is returning the response entity of a string. A method name is welcome. Or let's say that to be consistent welcome handler. Cool. And it is the post mapping. It is returning simple, just one. It is not taking any request body or whatever. It is saying that simply returning response entity of a string, welcome to Masai app without security, or you can say that welcome to Masai app, welcome endpoint. And HTTP status dot accepted. I hope no one having any problem with this endpoint. Please confirm. It is the simplest endpoint for post mapping / welcome. Get mapping welcome P. So इसे भी थोड़ा हम change कर देते हैं. So or let it be the welcome P. It is a get mapping welcome P handler. And Spring Security welcome P endpoint. And HTTP status okay. Cool. Next one is a get mapping admin. And this is the admin handler. And it is returning that is welcome to Masai app for admin. Let's go. Okay. So we have some endpoints out there. So how many get mapping? One, two get mapping, and one is a post mapping. Okay. So right now I have the Spring securities enabled, and that means I have given this username and password. I have not configured username and password out of the box. ठीक है. अभी आप मुझे ये बताओ फटाफट कि अगर हम वेलकम इसको थोड़ा सा हम चेंज कर देते हैं. पोस्ट मैपिंग शुड बी वेलकम टू. दिस शुड बी वेलकम. वेलकम की मतलब वेलकम पोस्ट. This should be welcome. This should be welcome. Now it's getting cool. So I have two endpoints as a get, admin and welcome P is a post mapping. अभी ये तीनों endpoint क्या है हमारे protected होंगे या नहीं होंगे? Yes. I will not allow to call any endpoint right now. Let me show you. So if I try to call from, let me run this application.
Now I'm going through the Postman. So using Postman, if I'm trying to call welcome, definitely I will get the 401 unauthorized. Okay, why it is not actually, I have already given the username and password. So if I'm inheriting from this, and now if I try to keep the without using any password, so 401 unauthorized. Cool. And I can call that admin also, it will not work. And if I try to call post, and here if I try to call welcome B, that is for post. So it should also not work. 401 unauthorized. So it is working as expected. लेकिन हम क्या चाहते हैं कि I want that this welcome should be or admin should be whitelisted. Admin can be called without giving the credential, without using a username and password. It should be called. क्योंकि think logically होता क्या है, या फिर हम चाहेंगे कि इसे हम whitelist कर दें. अभी क्या है, हमारे पास तीनों endpoint क्या है, तीनों endpoint protected है. That means without passing username and password, you won't be allowed to call this any kind of URI. But think a scenario like that. First, you are giving that accessibility to the user. He can register himself in the system. So वो पहले अपने आप को add कर पाए, तभी तो वो अपना login कर पाएगा. Here we have mentioning that username and password some hard coded value. But in real time, we don't have this type of scenario. We don't use the hard coded value. First, user should register himself with a valid username and password. Next time, if he is an authenticated, that means registered user, next time while calling any endpoint, he should pass his credential, that means his username and password. तो जब कहने का मतलब है कि जब वो अपने आप को रजिस्टर करे, उस वक्त उसे किसी भी यूजरनेम एंड पासवर्ड की जरूरत ना पड़े. He can simply call the endpoint and then he can register himself. लेकिन उसके बाद वाले जो endpoint को call करे, that time he required that his registered username and password. I hope you are getting the point. That means I want that at least one endpoint should be whitelisted. मतलब इसके लिए कोई भी username password की जरूरत ना हो, इनके लिए जरूरत पड़ जाए. If you do the different type of, if you have the requirement, so you have to define one configuration class. You can customize this default configuration. How we can customize for this? You need to create one configuration class. So I'm creating one class. Class name could be anything. So I'm giving the class name as, let's say that app config you can give, or project. Let me give that app config. You can give any name. First of all, to make this, let me stop the server first. इस क्लास को कॉन्फ़िगर करने के लिए, कॉन्फ़िगरेशन क्लास बनाने के लिए, you need to apply one annotation. You know that already, that is configuration. Then only this class will act as a configuration class. By the way, you remember, ये class भी हमारा act करता है configuration class की तरह. Yes or no? Please confirm. Your main class of Spring Boot is also working like a configuration class, because this is Spring Boot application annotation is a combination of your configuration also. We have already discussed about that. So you can write those configuration detail inside this class also. But since it is a security related configuration mention करना है, तो आप उसके लिए एक security config class लेंगे. इसका नाम हम बदल देते हैं, instead of app config, I am changing the name as what? Security config. So go to the refactor, rename, and security config. Cool, that will be better. Now inside this class, you need to specify one bean. Using that bean, you can customize the default behavior of your authentication. तो इसके लिए आपको एक bean लिखना है. So that means you need to define a method, and that method should return what? Security filter chain. Security filter chain. This is one interface. So that bean we need to register in our application, in our Spring project. So I'm defining a method here. Let's say that Masai config or Masai security config. You can change with your application name. Throws exception. Okay, in this method, you need to take one parameter. The parameter will be, that is your HTTP security. Cool. Now, this using HTTP security, what you need to do here, you need to define some configuration and you need to build the object of this security chain, security filter chain. इसका object आपको build करना है और return करना है, right? So here we need to create the security filter chain object using the help of this HTTP object, and you need to return it from this method. And that object you need to register with your container. तो आप बताओ यहाँ पे कौन सा annotation लगेगा? @b. So the returned object will be registered with your container. Does it make sense? Please confirm. Now be careful. Lots of students, they are complaining, sir, हमारा Spring Security का configuration काम नहीं कर रहा. Why? Because they just used to forget to put this configuration annotation. They used to forget this configuration annotation. And definitely अगर ये configuration नहीं होगा तो that will be treated as an ordinary class. Ordinary Java class, this method won't be invoked. So be sure that this is your configuration class. Inside that you need to register one bean. कौन सा bean? Security filter chain bean. And you need to specify your custom configuration. And this is your main bean by using which throughout the session आप इसी पे सारे configuration आप करोगे. कि किस हमें CSRF configuration करना है, CORS configuration करना है, JWT token activate करना है, या फिर form login activate करना है, या फिर filter supply करने हैं. सारे कॉन्फ़िगरेशन किस URL को whitelist करना है, किसे permit करना है, किसे authenticate करना है. You need to define all the security configuration inside this method using this HTTP security object. And at the last, you need to return this security filter chain. Let's quickly do that one. So first of all, what you need to do, the default configuration, the default behavior of this Spring Security is like that. You need to take that here HTTP, this object, and it is having a method. Lots of methods is there. There is a one method called authorize request. So there are two authorized requests if you are able to see here. Not two, here you will see that authorized request is there, which is deprecated. Authorized request, this is last one, last two is also deprecated. First one is also deprecated. Remember, we don't use that deprecated one. So just ये option के आगे cross लगा हुआ है and you will see that it is deprecated. So first one is deprecated, third, fourth is also deprecated. Second one is active here. So we should use the second one. Second one is taking one customizer object. So if you notice here, it is taking one customizer object. So you need to use second one, authorize HTTP request. Here it is accepting what one customizer object. Customizer object basically है क्या? ये एक आपका एक lambda expression pass करना पड़ेगा. And using that lambda expression, you can configure किस request को आप कितना customize करते हैं. How you are customizing that. So you can take that authorized request or, and this is the lambda expression, and here you need to write the configuration. Okay, so what you need to do first, the default configuration is mentioned in such a way that all the requests are authenticated. So auth dot any request dot authenticate. And at the last, what is there? You need to pass the two things. You need to configure before dot. Here you need to specify form login. Form login is also, there are two form login. The first one, which is taking 0 argument, it is deprecated. Second one, which is taking customizer. So you need to take that here, second one, which is not deprecated. And here right now, we are not going to enable our own form page. So in that case, we can specify customizer. Customizer is a generic time it will going to take. So just you can remove this generic things. And inside this, there's even a static method is there called with defaults. So how to pass this value, we will discuss on that. So this is the form login. And then after, you need to use again dot. And you need to use HTTP basic. This HTTP basic is also, you can see here, there are two HTTP basic. The first one is deprecated. Second one is taking the customizer. Using that customizer, you can customize the basic form page as well. So here you can do that similar kind of stuff. Customizer dot with defaults. You can see this documentation if you are not comfortable. So you can see here the first one, the first method got deprecated, removed from 7.0. In the older version of Spring Security or Spring Boot, it was working. But here you can see here, you can go to the second one, and it is mentioning here. This is that configure the HTTP basic authentication, and here you need to specify this. You can security config. Some example is also mentioned there. So HTTP basic with defaults, that is defaults with the default method is a part of customizer object. So using this way, you can customize this. We'll discuss about this one in much more detail. So let me just put this customizer dot with the defaults. Cool. So this is what we have configured this HTTP security object, this HTTP object, and this HTTP object, it will return the security filter chain. There is one another method we need to call here at the last, that is HTTP dot build, and it will return the object of default security filter chain, which is the implementation of security filter chain. So you need to call the build method and you need to return this. So this is the basic configuration you need to define. Let me just define here, and we're going to discuss each point in much more detail. First, let me just define here what's happening here. I have created one configuration class in which I have defined one method. This method signature is very important. It's throwing the exception, taking the parameter HTTP security. Return type is security filter chain, which is an interface. Okay. Now, using this object, we need to build the object. Using this HTTP parameter, you need to build the implementation of this object, having some configuration. So पहले तो हम configure करेंगे using this object. How we are configuring? I'm saying that who is calling this method? Your Spring Security filter will gonna call these methods to apply all the configuration. So using this HTTP, I'm saying that authorize HTTP request. I'm saying this is taking one lambda expression. Using this lambda expression, I'm saying any request should be authenticated. This is the default nature. And this is using one type of builder pattern. Here is your method completed. And then I'm using that dot. You can put that in a separate statement. Form login, customizer dot with defaults. And then after again dot and HTTP basic customizer dot with defaults. So this is basically, it is configuring and returning, that means HTTP security object itself, the modification configuration done here. Now you need to call HTTP.build. It will return the implementation of this object. That object will be registered with the bean. जैसे ये bean हमारे ये method will not be called. This will be called by the Spring container itself, and one object will be registered, which is totally configured object. अब ये Spring security filter chain will going to get configured, and accordingly your filters will gonna work. Now let me show you. So if I save this example, and now if I will run this example once again, you will see that we are going to see the similar kind of activity. That means everything will work as previously. जैसे हमारा normal काम कर रहा था, everything will work as it is. So if I am trying to call this post method, so it will be unauthenticated 401. If I will try to call get method admin get method, it also having the same problem. Now if I try to go to the browser, and let me try to call here the same thing. Let me just do the logout. It is already being logged out, and /admin. We close this console. I'm trying to access this get method, localhost admin. Now see here what will happen. Here this coming the your HTML page, right? Now if I'm trying to call here what I need to pass my username and password as well. Okay, now what I'm going to do here, I'm just removing from here this HTTP form login. अगर इस पार्ट को हम रिमूव कर दें, this form login basically is used for what? Your login page. The login page, how this login page is coming from the front end. From the browser, if you try to access, and this form page is generated based on this configuration, which is happen, this configuration is done automatically. I have just written this is as it is, but I'm going to remove this one, this form login. अब देखते हैं इसका behavior क्या होता है. My application got relaunched, and here I'm trying to access once again admin. Now you will see here, this time the welcome page is not coming. Here JavaScript dialog box is coming from my UI. Are you able to see the difference here? जैसे ही हमने ये फॉर्म लॉगिन को यहाँ से हमने रिमूव किया था अपने कॉन्फ़िगरेशन से, so then there is no any login page properly is coming. Here that is your JavaScript dialog box is coming, one confirm box is coming where you need to pass your username and password. So basically this form, let's revert it back. Form login method, it is used to customize your form page. And here I have just used the with defaults of the customizer class, but essentially you need to customize this form page. मतलब आप अपना खुद का login page define करना चाहते हो, then you can customize that login page here. That means you need to pass that code logic, which will render your HTML and your login page as well. Does it make sense? Please confirm. Hello? Cool. HTTP basic is basically for the application related. This is the HTTP basic related dialog box, whatever you are able to see. Okay, I'm trying to just remove both the statement from here and putting the semicolon. Save this. My application got started. Let me close this dialog box and try to open this localhost. And you will see that access to localhost was denied. You are not allowed to access. It is not asking any kind of username and password. Why? Because I have just removed this basic as well. So basic means what here? HTTP basic is displaying your JavaScript basic form dialog box where you are allowed to pass the username and password. You can customize that dialog box as well. And this form page to enable or show you the login sign up page. I hope it is clear. Please confirm. Cool. And using this HTTP object, you can here, if you notice, authorize HTTP request. And here I took the lambda expression, which is auth, taking as a parameter, and that parameter using this, I'm customizing this. I'm saying any request should be authenticated. But this is not my requirement. I want that some endpoints, let's say that admin, in order to call the admin API, it should not stop us. In that case, what we need to do, we need to write some other logic. So this should be authenticated. That's cool. Now you need to, instead of that, you need to write here again, this auth dot any request should be authenticated. Dot, you need to write here request matcher of one endpoint, that is slash admin dot permitter, like this. So I'm saying that सारे request authenticated होने, actually it will throw an exception. Why? Because this we should not use that सारे request authenticated होने के बाद हम किसी एक को permit all नहीं कर सकते. That should be written first and this should be written as next. So let me just remove this one. Auth dot request matcher slash admin. It should be permit all dot any request dot authenticate, like this. So I'm saying that कि ये जो admin वाला request है, it should be permitted. उसके बाद जितने सारे request है वो authenticated होने चाहिए. पिछले वाले में हमने क्या किया था कि पहले सबको हम authenticate कर देते, बाद में एक को permit all कर रहे, which is not allowed. We should go for the gradually decreasing size. कि ये हमारा permit all हो जाए, बाकी सारे request क्या हो जाए, authenticated. मतलब बाकी request के लिए it should ask stop us for username and password, but for admin it should not pass the username and password. Let's try to access this one, check out that whether it's working or not. Now I'm opening this terminal once again, and here I'm trying to call admin. And here I'm able to access this welcome to Kasai app for admin. But if I try to call in other URL, let's say that welcome. Now it is asking me the username and password. Does it make sense? Please confirm. This is called whitelisting. This is called what? Whitelisting of your endpoint. So let me just show you once again. So here one route I have whitelisted, and this one remaining all are the authenticated. Okay, Ritik is saying that we can use it for sign up page. We can use it if we want to whitelist to endpoint. Yes, Sarthak, that is the next step. We are going to see that. Ritik is saying we can use it for sign up page. Which one you are saying that? This one. This is from your what by default sign up page, login page is created for you. If you are calling this endpoint from your application to application, suppose अगर आप Swagger से या किसी और चीज से call करना है, that thing we are going to see that. But it's the default nature. लेकिन say that let's say that you are trying to call from your Angular or React or from JavaScript, then you don't require this sign up page. क्योंकि उस वक्त हमें sign up page नहीं चाहिए, क्योंकि वहां पे interaction क्या होगा, ये जो API कॉल होंगे वो हमारे JavaScript से कॉल होंगे या फिर किसी और application से कॉल होगा. It is not called by the user directly. Am I correct? So that time this sign up page is not required. You will see that all the possibilities. But for the time being, you need to understand how to permit, how to just use that permit all and how to use that whitelist and how to do that authenticated all. Now I'm trying to use here what let's say that my controller हम चाहते हैं कि इस welcome को भी हम whitelist कर दें या welcome नहीं, let's say that this is the admin and I'm creating one another get mapping. And this one I'm making as what? User. This is the user handler. And this one, let's say that what user. Cool. Now I want that this admin and user both should be whitelisted. Both should be whitelisted in this case. So my application is saved. And here I'm going to use here this is admin. Now I want to use that other one. Since this is a request matcher, I can specify as a comma separated value any kind of API like this. Now the admin and user both will be whitelisted, but remaining all will be authenticated. Does it make sense? Please confirm. Cool. Now let's try to see here. So my application is there. Now if I try to call here admin, I'm able to see the response. And if I try to call user, I should also be able to access this. User is also working. But if I'm trying to call here, let's say welcome. Now it won't allow. Similarly, let me show you from the postman. So postman, admin, if I try to call, no problem. I will be allowed to call this one. Yes, we are getting the success response. I'm able to call this user. Yes, I'm allowed to call this one. And if I try to call welcome, it will be unauthenticated 401. In order to call this pass, we need to pass the password from the authorization. We need to use here basic auth, and then we can send it. Here we are allowed to call this endpoint as well. Till this point, anyone having any doubt, please confirm. How to whitelist multiple endpoints? Hello? Cool. Now let's see the magic here. The next important thing. I want that this post request, post mapping welcome P. That's P indicate post. हम इसे चाहते हैं whitelist करना. So what to do? Go to the config, and here I'm just using slash welcome P. So I'm saying that welcome P should also be permitted. This time, see the magic here, what will happen. Since welcome P is a post request, so I cannot use the browser to send this request. Browser से हम post request नहीं fire कर सकते हैं. We have to go to the, we need to use this post now. So here we need to use the post welcome P. Will it be accessible or not accessible? I'm not using the basic auth username password, which is inherited from that. And I'm not passing any username and password. Will it be allowed to access? Please confirm. I have whitelisted here, but if you just send the request, it will give you what? Unauthorized. Even though you are allowing this post request, but due to there is a one problem, I told you that. What is that? CSRF attack. By default, CSRF attack is not allowed. That means what? Post request and put request is not allowed from the client due to the CSRF attack. Post request and put request is not allowed, even though you are permitting that. Even though you are permitting them, it is not allowed. You need to configure your CSRF protection, cross-site request fuzzy. Then only you are allowed to call the post and put request. Otherwise, आपने allowed कर भी दिया इसे, फिर भी आप put and post request को call नहीं कर पाओगे. Why sir? Because put and post request required your data updation. It may require. हमने यहाँ पे कोई request body send नहीं किया है, of course, लेकिन हम भेज सकते हैं, right? We can send that one using post. Right now I'm not sending, but we can send that. Using post and put is basically meant for what? Posting some resource and updating some resource. And by default, due to the CSRF protection enabled in our Spring security, post request and put request is not allowed. In order to call them, what you need to do, you need to apply one configuration. What configuration? That configuration is what here? That is here. Before that form login, there is the one configuration called CSRF. CSRF also, there is two CSRF methods, CSRF and customizer. This time you need to use the second one. First one got deprecated. It was used in the previous version. But this time you need to use CSRF here. This time, this customizer ko hum with default nahi use karenge. We need to disable this. How to disable this? We need to take a lambda expression in CSRF, one parameter, and then CSRF dot disable. Like this. Actually, I'm saying that, hey, Spring security, please don't enable this CSRF protection default one for my post and put request. आप इसे अभी के लिए disable करिए. Is it a recommended approach? No, it is not recommended approach. Spring security ने जब enable किया हुआ है post and put request, मतलब ये security concern है कि जब तक user login ना हो by default कोई हमारे system में unauthenticated people should not do any post and put request. So you have to. Here, first option is that, which is the temporary option. You can disable this CSRF protection. And this is the way to disable the CSRF protection. That means in this method, HTTP authorized request. After that, you need to call dot CSRF, pass one lambda expression CSRF, and here CSRF dot disable. This is the way to disable the CSRF protection. But in real time, we should not disable the CSRF as it is, right? This will disable for all the endpoints. No, all for post and put request. CSRF protection will be removed. मतलब अब कोई भी unauthenticated user भी आपके system में data को post कर सकता है और update भी कर सकता है. But this is not recommended in real-time production environment. In production environment, you need to apply some different technique. Some CSRF token you need to generate. How this CSRF token will generate, how to configure this CSRF, we are going to discuss in tomorrow's session or hopefully day after tomorrow's session. If time permits tomorrow, otherwise day after tomorrow. But for the timing, you need to understand कि कोई भी हम post request या put request permit all करने के बाद भी call नहीं कर पाएंगे जब तक हमारा CSRF disable ना हो. It is a way to disable the CSRF. But this is not a permanent solution for the CSRF attack. Our application is vulnerable to be attacked by the CSRF. CSRF attack होता क्या है, कैसे करते हैं हम? Basically, I have shown one example. कोई भी आपके authenticated session को लेके और कोई malicious activity आपके system में कर सकता है. We have the proper solution. How to apply the proper solution, we will see later. For the time being, you need to just disable the CSRF token. CSRF as it is. Make sense? Now, since I will save this application, let me check out that. This welcome key is also permitted all. Just try to call this post and welcome key. This time I should be allowed to call without passing any username and password. Am I clear? How to call the post method without or whitelist the post method? Cool. So this is what we discussed, that form login page, and how to disable the CSRF in order to call the post method or put method, and how to whitelist, and all requests will be authenticated. Okay, now let's see that our basic flow of our screen security. So what I'm going to do there, just write this welcome controller, copy this. Because in this type of example is there in your notes as well, लेकिन उसमें नाम थोड़े कुछ अलग-अलग है. That's why I'm putting this one example here. Example. Welcome controller dot Java. This is the welcome controller, and this is security config dot Java. Cool. You can refer any both example. Remaining things is not important because remaining things are as it is. Okay. Now let's go to our some theory part. So some theory part we are going to just explore that कि internally कैसे काम करता है और इसे हम और भी हम कैसे customize कर सकते हैं. So as I explained that this diagram, these components are super important. So let's spend a few moments on this diagram. Okay. Now, whenever any client will give the request to our application, what will happen? We have seen that the security filters chain जो है वो activate हो जाता है. और वो हमारा काम कैसे करता है, उसमें मेन कंपोनेंट क्या-क्या चीजें होती हैं उस फिल्टर के अंदर. तो this is the security filter chain will be there, it will be activated. Now initially जब भी यूजर क्या करता है, यूजरनेम एंड पासवर्ड पास करता है. First of all, he has to get what I'm talking about, that protected API. I'm not talking about the whitelisted API. किस बाय डिफॉल्ट सारे एपीआई हमारे प्रोटेक्टेड है. सो यूजर जैसे ही लॉगिन हमारा यूजर करेगा, मतलब सेंड एनी रिक्वेस्ट, फर्स्ट ऑफ ऑल वन साइन अप पेज विल कम. User has to pass the username and password. Your client has to pass the username and password. Once the username and password is given, what will happen? Among this filter security, that means security filter chain, एक filter ऐसा है हमारा जो क्या करता है, it will take that username and password and compose one authentication object. It will create which object? Authentication object. This authentication object is having your initial username and password. कि यूजर का यूजरनेम क्या है, उसका पासवर्ड क्या है, उसकी अथॉरिटी क्या है, उसके रोल क्या है, all those things will be encapsulated. Initially it will have the username and password. Listen carefully. So one filter, उस filter का नाम हम बताएंगे आपको. There is a one filter which will take that username and password from the sign up page or from your basic here. That means base encoded form, whatever the username password you are supplying, that will be taken and form one authentication object. This authentication object is super important. Then after, this filter chain will delegate this authentication object to the authentication manager. सारे authentication को manage करने के लिए एक manager होता है, but our authentication manager will take that object. This authentication manager, by the way, it is an interface. Authentication भी interface है. इसका भी कोई ना कोई implementation class है. Authentication manager is also an interface. Authentication provider is also an interface. User detail service is also an interface. These are the classes. Okay. But this authentication manager is an interface. We will see that what classes are there. So that authentication, which is having the initial username and password, will be passed to the authentication manager. Authentication manager will check how many authentication provider I have, which is a suitable authentication provider. कौन कौन सा authentication provider है जो authentication हमें provide करके दे. एक वैलिड करके दें यूजर नेम एंड पासवर्ड को कि ये यूजर नेम पासवर्ड वैलिड है। तो उसके लिए ऑथेंटिकेशन मैनेजर किसके पास जाता है? इट विल गो टू द ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर। नाउ वी हैव अ डिफरेंट डिफरेंट ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर ऑलरेडी। स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी वालों ने क्या किया है, हमारे लिए बहुत सारे ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर बना के रखे हैं। जस्ट लाइक दैट DAO ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर विच इज अ डिफॉल्ट ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर। जब स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी काम करता है, इट इज टेकिंग द हेल्प ऑफ DAO ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर। इट इज द डिफॉल्ट वन। We have the LDAP authentication provider is also there, custom authentication provider। मतलब ये authentication provider हम खुद से भी लिख सकते हैं। We can write our own custom authentication provider। Some of the predefined authentication providers are there। We can write our own custom authentication provider as well, and we will see that. Hopefully in tomorrow's session we are going to write one custom authentication provider। Okay, now these authentication provider will gonna take the help of कि अब इन्हें क्या चाहिए, authentication करना है हमें। तो ऑथेंटिकेशन को मैच करना कि यूजर नेम पासवर्ड सही है नहीं, ये सारा काम ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर का है। लेकिन इसे मैच करने के लिए जो रजिस्टर्ड यूजर है उसका डेटाबेस से डेटा पुल करना जरूरी है। इट नीड दैट यूजर डिटेल्स। नाउ दिस ऑथेंटिकेशन प्रोवाइडर विल टेक द हेल्प फ्रॉम यूजर डिटेल सर्विस। दिस यूजर डिटेल सर्विस इज सुपर इंपॉर्टेंट इंटरफेस। इसके अंदर एक मेथड होता है लोड यूजर बाय यूजर नेम। नाउ दिस यूजर डिटेल सर्विस, basically what it will do that it will talk to your database, fetch the detail of your registered user, pull the its entire details. Now this implementation you can write with your own, but here also we have some inbuilt solutions out there. Our Spring security team has implemented this interface, and he has given some classes like in-memory user detail service. It is a default implementation। It is having one implementation एक class का बना बनाया है। It will have JDBC user detail service, JDBC user detail service, and we can write our own custom implementation as well। मतलब जितने भी इंटरफेस है ना स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी ने इनका सॉल्यूशन भी इम्प्लीमेंटेशन भी दे रखा है, और इतना फ्लेक्सिबल बना दिया है कि आप चाहो तो खुद का भी आप अपना इम्प्लीमेंटेशन लिख लो। तो यूजर डिटेल सर्विस जो इंटरफेस है जिसका मेन काम है डेटाबेस से यूजर के डिटेल को निकालना, तो इसके लिए भी कुछ बने बनाए क्लासेस है हमारे पास, जैसे इन मेमोरी यूजर डिटेल सर्विस, जेडीबीसी यूजर डिटेल सर्विस, जेडीबीसी यूजर डिटेल सर्विस है। और हम चाहे तो खुद का भी हम कस्टम यूजर डिटेल सर्विस भी हम लिख सकते हैं। टुडे वी आर गोइंग टू सी दैट वन एग्जांपल ऑफ कस्टम यूजर डिटेल सर्विस। अब ये जितने भी यूजर डिटेल सर्विस है सबका काम क्या है? लोड यूजर बाय यूजर नेम, यूजर नेम के अकॉर्डिंग यूजर की डिटेल को एक्सेस कर लेगा, and that user detail will be provided in the form of user details object। यूजर डिटेल्स ऑब्जेक्ट के अंदर उस यूजर के सारे डिटेल्स होंगे। कौन से डिटेल? कि उसका पासवर्ड है कौन सा है, उसका यूजर नेम क्या है, उसकी अथॉरिटी क्या है, उसके रोल क्या क्या है, उसका अकाउंट एक्सपायर है या नहीं, ये सारे डिटेल इस यूजर डिटेल्स के अंदर पड़ेंगे। एंड अगेन दिस यूजर डिटेल्स इज आल्सो एन इंटरफेस, और इसके भी इंप्लीमेंटेशन हमारे पास पड़ेगा। लेट मी रिपीट दिस वन। We will see that. We will see that is Spring security context. Now, what will happen here? Once this, let's say that in-memory user details or custom user detail service, it has fetched the user detail from the database, and it will provide that to the user detail service. This user detail service will pull that user details from this implementation from your database, and this user detail will be given to the authentication provider। By default authentication provider is a DAO authentication provider। इसका काम क्या है कि इस यूजर डिटेल्स को और ये सप्लायर जो इस ऑथेंटिकेशन में पासवर्ड और यूजर नेम आ रहा है उन्हें मैच करना, चेक करना कि ऑथेंटिकेशन सक्सेस है। अगर सक्सेस है देन इट विल रिटर्न द ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट। जहां से ये ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट लेगा और जैसे सफल हो गया हमारा ऑथेंटिकेशन, इस यूजर डिटेल के डिटेल से ये जो यूजर नेम पासवर्ड है मैच कर गया, then it will provide the same authentication object to the authentication manager। But the difference will be in this authentication object only the username password is there, but once the authentication is successful it will provide you the again authentication object in which there is a one principal object कि इस अब ये हमारे पास जो ऑब्जेक्ट है इसके अंदर हमारे पास प्रिंसिपल ऑब्जेक्ट लिया, दैट मींस यस दिस यूजर इज ऑथेंटिकेटेड। and that authentication object will be given to the authentication manager. That authentication manager will pass the authentication object, which is having the principal object, to the filters. Filters will keep that authentication object into the security context. अब अगली बार जब रिक्वेस्ट आएगा मतलब सिक्योरिटी कॉन्टेक्स्ट विल होल्ड दैट ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट हियर अगेन. मतलब यहां से जो रिक्वेस्ट आया ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट बना, इसके अंदर सिर्फ यूजर नेम पासवर्ड मिलेगा, लेकिन जो यहां से ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट रिटर्न आ रहा है आपके पास, उसके अंदर यूजर की सारी डिटेल साथ साथ एक प्रिंसिपल का ऑब्जेक्ट होगा. प्रिंसिपल ऑब्जेक्ट विल इंडिकेट कि दिस यूजर इज ऑथेंटिकेटेड. This user is authenticated and that object will be kept under the security context. Next time user will give the request. Now this time it will check that, hey Spring Security, do you have authentication object having the same JSession ID? It will say yes. This time it will just skip all the steps, directly it will call your endpoints because that user is got authenticated. Got it? अगली बार जब भी रिक्वेस्ट आएगा वो सिक्योरिटी कॉन्टेक्स्ट चेक करेगा कि इसके अंदर ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट प्रिंसिपल इज एस्टैब्लिश्ड और नॉट. इफ द प्रिंसिपल इज एस्टैब्लिश्ड इन द सिक्योरिटी कॉन्टेक्स्ट, it will skip all those steps and directly it will call your endpoints. It will not perform this options again and again because this user is logged in user. Make sense? ओके अभी इसके बारे में थोड़ा हम जैसे जैसे प्रैक्टिकल करते जाएंगे ना, अभी हो सकता है पहली बार आपको कुछ चीजें समझ में ना आई हो कि ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट क्या है, ऑथेंटिकेशन मैनेजर क्या है, बट बिलीव मी ये सारे काफी सिंपल सिंपल चीजें हैं. इसके बारे में हम थोड़ा पहले देख लेते हैं नोट्स एंड देन वी विल डिस्कस अबाउट दैट. सो पहले बात करते हैं फिल्टर चेन or Spring Security Filter. A series of security filters intercept each request and work together to identify the authentication is required or not. If authentication is required, accordingly, navigate the user to the login page or use the existing details stored in the or stored during the initial authentication. मतलब ये security context से verify हो जाएगा कि ये हमारा user authenticated है. Now, next talking about this authentication object. Authentication object, as I told you, initially it will take the username and password before login, and after login successful, again this authentication object will be stored in the security context. But difference is, इस बार जो authentication object will be kept in the security context will have the principal object. You see that here. Now there is one filter called username password authentication filter. ये इसका काम है क्या करना, username and password को लेना and composing the authentication object. So there is a filter like username password authentication filter will extract the username password from request, prepare the authentication type object, because authentication object is a core standard of storing authentication user details inside Spring Security framework. Now here authentication is an interface and the implementation class name is username password authentication token. अब ये जो ऑथेंटिकेशन मैंने हमसे बात किए थे हमने कि दिस ऑथेंटिकेशन ऑब्जेक्ट, लेट मी जस्ट do the practical thing. Authentication, this is an interface और इसका जो implementation class है उसका नाम क्या है, username password authentication token. So essentially this object will be created. Who will create that object? Username password authentication filter. ये एक फिल्टर है जिसका काम है यूजरनेम पासवर्ड को एक्सट्रैक्ट करना और इस यूजरनेम पासवर्ड ऑथेंटिकेशन टोकन का ऑब्जेक्ट बनाना. मतलब इस ऑब्जेक्ट के अंदर आपको क्या मिल जाएगा, यूजरनेम एंड पासवर्ड. Am I clear? Please confirm. Now let me show you this object. If I can show you, Control Shift T and pass here username password authentication token, and this is your filter and this is your token. So if you take this token, so username password authentication token, it is extending abstract authentication token. And if you see that this abstract authentication token is extending your authentication object. Okay. Now this authentication object is there. This authentication object got created. And now what will happen? Now this authentication object will be passed to the authentication manager. कि है हमने एक टोकन का ऑब्जेक्ट बना दिया, आपके पास यूजर नेम पासवर्ड है. Now here authentication manager, you will decide further what to do. Once the authentication object is formed, Spring Security Filter will hand over the request to the authentication manager. This authentication manager will manage the actual authentication logic. कि कौन सा हमारा authentication logic कौन-कौन हमारा कर रहा है. So this authentication manager will check what are the authentication providers are available inside our application. आपके पास कौन-कौन सा authentication provider है. मतलब काम गया मैनेजर के पास, मैनेजर चेक करेगा कौन-कौन से डेवलपर है आपके यहाँ. उन डेवलपर से हम बात करेंगे कि कौन-कौन से डेवलपर इस चीज को डेवलप कर सकते हैं, राइट. सो मैनेजर विल टॉक टू द प्रोवाइडर्स. Now we can define one or any number of two or any number of authentication provider. कितने भी चाहे तो हम प्रोवाइडर को हम डिफाइन कर सकते हैं. Then after what will happen? It delegates the validation of the user details to the authentication provider available. Since there can be multiple providers inside that, it is the responsibility of authentication manager to manage all the authentication provider available. मतलब एक से ज्यादा भी authentication provider हो सकते हैं. Now here authentication manager is your interface and the implementation class is provider manager. So here the authentication manager is an interface and its implementation class is provider manager. अब ये प्रोवाइडर मैनेजर करता क्या है, इसके अंदर एक मेथड होता है. मेथड का नाम होता है क्या? ऑथेंटिकेशन. ऑथेंटिकेट and the parameter is also authentication. Like this. So basically what it will do that it will take the authentication object, this manager, and call this authenticate method by passing this authentication object to this parameter. अब इसके अंदर this authentication, this method is defined inside the provider manager, which is the authentication manager. इसके अंदर ये जो diagram हम देखे थे, this one here. Now inside this method you can think what will happen. This method will talk to which one? Can you guess by watching this diagram? This method belongs to authentication manager, which is the provider manager is the implementation. ये एक interface है, ये इसका main implementation class है, उसके अंदर एक method है. अब ये जो authenticate method है, किससे talk करेगा? कौन से component से? Please guess here. It will talk to anyone. I need your response in the chat box. Hello. Yes, basically DAO authentication provider you can say, or you can say authentication provider. Authentication provider is an interface, so it will basically talk to the authentication provider. So here it will call the following method of the authentication provider. अब ये authentication provider कितने भी सारे हो सकते हैं. डिफॉल्ट जो है उसका नाम क्या है? DAO authentication provider. DAO authentication provider, which is the default one by default. But we can create our own authentication provider also, right? Manager will manage कि कौन सा authentication provider use करना है. You can configure more than one authentication provider if you have the two-factor authentication in there. Okay, so अब ये authentication provider से talk करेगा, and internally, guess what? It will similar kind of method is also there inside this authentication provider. So it will, there is another method is there inside the authentication provider, like this. and which is having this type of method is also good. This method, guess what it will do? What this method authenticate, which is taking authentication object, which is returning the authentication object. Okay. Now this method belongs to the authentication provider, which is the authentication provider. और ये जो ऊपर वाला authenticate method है, it belongs to provider manager, that is your authentication manager. Don't confuse here कि दो method ये दो बार क्यों लिखे हुए हैं, दो अलग-अलग classes. We will discuss in a moment. Now guess what? This is your the authentication provider. अब इसका काम किससे connect करना है? It will take the help of your what? User detail service. It will take the help of your user detail service and get that user details. So there is it will talk to so basically this is an interface, user detail service, which is having a method called user details load user by username, which will take string username. This method will basically take that user details from the database, compose the user details object, and hand over to the user details service. That the authentication provider will take that user details from the user details service, and it will do what? Compose that another authentication object based on this authentication and return that. अब आप मुझे ये बताओ पहले तो कि सर इन दोनों में क्या डिफरेंस है? पैरामीटर में भी ऑथेंटिकेशन है, रिटर्न टाइप भी ऑथेंटिकेशन है. Suppose our authentication gets success, then what will be the difference between this object and this object? The difference is it is taking the authentication object. Let's say that go to the first level. Yes, the principal object, correct location. This authentication object will have just username and password. It will not say anything about key my authentication success or not. But once here it will pass that same object over here as well. It will also having the username and password. लेकिन जैसे ये यूजर डिटेल्स मिल गया आपको and your authentication provider will validate username and password it matches with the user details, it will populate the principal object inside this authentication and it will return it back. That means the return authentication object will have the principal object which indicates the authenticated user. Same object will be returned back by the authentication manager here as well, and this object will be placed where? Inside the security context. Does it make sense? Please confirm. Cool. Now let me show you some ops so that you'll get that super clear. So here I'm talking about provider manager. Provider manager is a class of authentication manager. So this is the implementation class of authentication manager, provider manager. And you will see that provider manager implements authentication manager and it is having a method. You'll see that it is having a method to verify कौन सा provider हमें use करना है. It can take multiple authentication provider and it will check कि कौन से provider को use करना है. But the main important method is this one. Authenticate. Method name authenticate, parameter is authentication, and here is the return type is also authentication. And it will call the authentication on authentication provider. Right? So it will call this method here on the authentication provider. That means this method, as I mentioned here, authenticate method will talk to the DAO authentication provider because default is the DAO authentication provider. So let me just check out that. Control T, DAO authentication provider. This DAO authentication provider, it is indirectly using the authentication provider. Let me show you. Here it is authentication provider implementation of that. And here you will notice there is a method called authenticate. Also, you will find it over here. This method, I guess it will be there in this parent class. That is abstract user details authentication provider. Here it will, you'll find this authenticate method. Here it is. And this authenticate object will going to talk to your user details. And based on that user details, it will match that whether your object is working properly or not. The entire description is mentioned, whatever I have told you, that is here. This authentication method inside authentication manager, this is the method. And this authenticate method will check the various supported authentication provider. And then this authenticate method will call another authenticate method on the implementation of appropriate authentication provider. Authentication provider is also an interface, and default implementation of this provider is Tau authentication provider. Now we can define our own authentication provider implementation also. Authentication provider karta kya hai? Authentication provider will have all the core logic validating user details authentication inside this provider. We can define the actual authentication, that is whether we want to validate the user credential against database or from LDAP server or from any authorization server. Okay, so this authorization server is a part of your OAuth 2. We are going to discuss in the last session. We can configure multiple authentication provider inside the authentication providers. We can write our actual authentication logic right away, or we can utilize Spring Security provided classes or interfaces, which is like user details manager or user details service. Because whenever we want to perform some authentication, our requirement would be load the user details from the storage system. तो मतलब चाहे तो हम authentication provider खुद से लिख सकते हैं, otherwise हम क्या कर सकते हैं, बने बनाए कुछ क्लासेस का हम यूज कर सकते हैं और कुछ इंटरफेसेस का, जैसे कि यूजर डिटेल्स मैनेजर और यूजर डिटेल्स सर्विस. Because ultimately our task is to load the data, user details from the database, which is done by directly here. So user details manager or service, using that, this is what it helps to retrieving and creating and updating, deleting the user details from the database storage system. One of the core interface of Spring Security, the authentication of any request mostly depend upon the implementation of user detail service. And it is having a method load user by username. So this is a user detail service, which is having a method load user by username, take the username, and here is a user details is a return type. Okay. Now, basically what will happen, we have discussed this already. And since we have password inside the authentication, this is a little bit important one. So please concentrate here. Since we have the password inside the authentication, we don't just want to store them or perform authentication with plain text password. मतलब जब भी हम ऑथेंटिकेशन की बात होती है ना, तो वहां पे यूजर नेम पासवर्ड आते हैं, तो पासवर्ड हम एज इट इज प्लेन पासवर्ड वी शुड नॉट यूज दैट, because plain password is a security vulnerability. If you see here our security breach in our application right now, I have configured in that here in our application.properties. So I have configured the plain text username and password, which is not recommended approach. It is a vulnerability in the term of Spring Security. That's why we should always encrypt or hash our password. या तो हम उसे encrypt करें या फिर hash करें. Basically, we need to use the hashing. What is the difference between encryption and hashing? We will see that. So when we are storing them in a storage system, or when we are trying to fetch and validate the password provided by the end user. So basically, we need to use our encoded or hashed password. We should avoid that storing the plain password. So in order to perform all the password related standard and logic, we have the password encoders interface and its implementation inside the Spring Security framework. हमारे पास password encoder नाम का interface है, हम उसे use करेंगे और इससे हमारा काम काफी आसान हो जाएगा. We can hash our password, we can encrypt our password, whatever we want. Basically, we can hash our password. What is the difference between encryption, encoding, and hashing? We will see in a moment. That is your Spring security context, जहाँ पे आपके authentication manager provide करेगा authentication object, and that will be kept having the principal object. Having the principal object होता क्या है? It is a person who has identified through the process of authentication. The principal is a currently logged in user, currently logged in account. When the authentication with the application, the application establishes the principal and remembers it. This is the reason we need to authenticate only once We don't need to authenticate again and again for any other. Make sense? Please confirm till this point. Listen, this is little bit theory part, and I know some of you may feel some little bit boring, but believe me, only this part is the only, you can say that, theory part, and you can say a little bit boring part. But if you just have the proper flow कि हमारा कैसे काम करता है this architecture flow, and the entire description is revolved around this, then you will feel very much comfortable in the implementation part when we are going to use that JWT token or authorization and remaining stuff. It will be super simple. That's why I given too much time to read all these things line by line and explain you in much more detail how this thing is working. But don't worry if you are not able to understand few concepts, because as soon as we are going to implement these interfaces, authentication provided with ourselves, you will get much more clarity. Okay. Now, here is our main authentication object, which I told you that, which is having pre-authentication, which is having username and password, and after it will have the principal object. So it is having some methods like get authorities, get credential, get details, get principal, is authenticated, set authenticated. So these are the methods are there in the authentication interface. The implementation is username password authentication program. So Spring Security Flow, just now we have discussed already कि हमारा login page कैसे generate होता है. Please refer this one. It will same thing whatever I have discussed. So first username password filter will extract the username password, create that authentication object, and hand over this authentication object to the authenticate method of provider manager. Provider manager is implementation of authentication manager. It will identify which are the supported authentication provider. Default is this one, DAO authentication provider. DAO authentication provider will use of load user by username of user retail service, and then it will check out that, validate, compare that password with the validated password here, authenticated or not. And later it will keep the data in a security context. Same thing is mentioned here with the diagram. You can just understand this one. This is the authentication filter. There are three filters like abstract security intercepted, username password authentication filter, default login page generating filter. It will extract that here, step 2, username and password, create the authentication object, which is the implementation is a username password authentication token. यहाँ पे authenticate method call होगा by passing this authentication object, and in a step 3, here is your authentication manager, which will invoke the authenticate. Again, it will goes to the provider manager. It will also call the authenticate object method, and provider manager will use your load user by username. It will return the user details. These user details will be taken, and based on that user detail, your DAO authentication provider will compose that authentication object and keep the principal object here. That object will be returned back again, and that object will be stored to the security context. Now, just 5 minutes more to just discuss about this password management, and then after we will see one example. But before that password management, to discuss about this one, let's see one example. I'm going to register some user here. I'm going to register some default instead of using this default user in application.properties. Yeah. So instead of using this, let me delete this one. I want to register 2 or 3 users. 2-3 users को हम register करते हैं. So what are the steps you need to follow? So for that one, let me just go to here and see that some configuration and how to create the Spring project. These are the examples we have already executed. Now, so Spring Security project with custom user using in-memory user detail manager. We are going to use in-memory user detail manager. ये क्या कौन सा क्लास है? अगर आप ध्यान से देखो इस डायग्राम को. So in this diagram, you will notice there is a one class called in-memory user detail service. ये पहले से implemented class है. हम इस class का use करेंगे और कुछ user को हम बनाएंगे जो हमारे in-memory user होंगे हमारे. Only few user we are going to create, which will act as an in-memory user. Later, we are going to create our custom user detail service, which will load that user details from the database. Right. So right now we are going to use in-memory user detail service class, which is the implementation of user detail service, which will return that user details in return type, which will be used by this authentication provider and your authentication manager. So let's quickly use this in-memory user detail service class, which is the implementation class of your user detail service. Okay, so what are the steps here? So let me just go to data. Yeah. So here what we need to do, this is that our user detail service and in-memory user detail service class is there. Now we need to just register one bean. We have two approaches. What does it mean in memory user detail? In memory user detail का मतलब क्या होता है ना कि जो पहले हम application dot properties में कर रहे थे वो भी एक तरह का in memory user details ही है, लेकिन वहां पे हम एक ही bean को एक ही यूजर को कॉन्फ़िगर कर पाते हैं, लेकिन हमारी रिक्वायरमेंट है कि हम 2-3 यूजर को कॉन्फ़िगर करें अपने हिसाब से. तो अब उस केस में एक स्प्रिंग सिक्योरिटी का बना हुआ क्लास आप यूटिलाइज कर सकते हो, इन मेमोरी यूजर डिटेल मैनेजर. आप इससे आप जितने चाहे उतने यूजर को आप रजिस्टर कर सकते हो अपने सिस्टम पे. मेक सेंस लोकेश? Now you have multiple options how many user you want to register. So let me just quickly copy this bean. This is the first option, and here I'm just going to paste that in my string security configuration. That is security config, and after this method, that is I've already registered one bean here, which is the configuration. I'm going to use another bean. Testing it over here. This is the user of Spring Security Core. जो भी आप यूज करना वो Spring Security Core वाले लाइब्रेरी से यूज करना, Core User Details user. Finish it. Okay. Now see here, there is a one bean I'm registering, that is in-memory user details manager. This is the method name. Any method name you can take, user details service or whatever. So this is the in-memory user details. अब इस ऑब्जेक्ट को बनाने के तरीके क्या क्या है हमारे पास? तो हमारे पास एक क्लास है यूजर क्लास, which is the implementation of this user details. This user class is having a method called with default password encoder. मतलब ये default password encoder क्या है कि अभी हमने बात की कि password we should not put that as a plain text. Should always prefer to put a password in a hash format. So in order to use that, right now I'm not using any hashing technique. I'm just going to use some dummy username password with the normal, that means plain text password. So that's why it is coming as a strict line here. That is what it is not recommended. This method was what's saying that this method default password of the user type deprecated. So it is not recommended to use this method. And it is got deprecated, but still there is one option. You can call this with default password encoded and dot username admin dot password 123 dot authorize authorities. You can pass the some role and authority here, admin and dot previous. So user class के अंदर कुछ static method है which will take some build factory pattern. Using that you can configure one object and it will return you the user details object. So this is a one user detail object which is admin. Similarly, I have created another user details for user 1234 and which is having the authorities as read. हमने कुछ authorities से provide कर दिया, अब चाहो तो इसे आप skip भी कर सकते हो इस authorities को. लेकिन authorities होता क्या है इसके बारे में बाद में बात करेंगे. So I just keep this authorities here admin and here read authority. So user will have the read authority, admin is having the admin authority. He can perform some other tasks. What are the authorities? Tomorrow we are going to discuss in much more detail. So essentially, I have created the two user details object right here. How? By calling this user class, some methods are there, and I'm configuring this. Then I'm returning that in-memory user details object. So this is the constructor of in-memory user details, where this constructor is a very, very flexible object. You can pass n number of user details. I'm passing this admin I'm passing this user. If I want to create some other details, let's say that I want to create one more object. So let's say that it is customer. Right? So username is, let's say, Ravi, password 1234, which is having read, and I can pass here as well. So how many objects you want, you can pass that in a constructor. By this way, right now, अब आपके application में तीन user बन चुके हैं. कौन से? Admin, user, and Ravi, which is having their authority, and this is the password. Does it make sense? Please confirm. Hello? Now, let me just restart the application and see that whether it's working or not. So application got started, and here I'm going to just try to access one endpoint. Let's say that it is welcome. So it is asking me the here username. I'm passing Ravi and password 1234. And here I'm able to access this endpoint. Make sense? How we can configure multiple user in our system? This is the in-memory user details. So ये in-memory user details का नाम क्यों है? क्योंकि ये जो आपके user बने हैं ना, it is internally used in your application. In your application, there is a one hash map is created, and in that hash map, if you see that implementation, there is a one hash map is created, and that hash map is holding that your static user details. Make sense? That's why it is in-memory user details. Now, there is another option to create this in-memory user details option. And in that option, let's see here, what is there? So there's another option, approach 2 will be there. Here we create the bean of password encoded separately. So in that case, let me copy this 2 beans and replace this one. This bean in memory user details, I'm just removing this. And here I'm pasting 2 beans. ये एक दूसरा अप्रोच है, वही सेम एग्जांपल आपको मिलेंगे, लेकिन यहाँ पे दूसरे तरीके से हमने इन मेमोरी यूजर डिटेल्स का ऑब्जेक्ट बनाया. ये भी हम इन मेमोरी यूजर डिटेल्स को ही हम रजिस्टर कर रहे हैं. वो क्या ऑप्शन है? So here we need to create the in-memory user details manager, or this class object you have to create. So this object you have created, and then you need to create how many users you want. So user details admin, user with username, dot password, dot authorities, dot build. One user got created. Another user, that is the username and password. Now in this object, there is a method called create user. Pass this admin, pass this user, and return this object. As simple as this. So you can create, this is the admin, this is a user. Iska username admin hai, iska username user hai. Password, you can take any password. Now, this bean will not work individually. Why? Because you need to tell how I am storing my password. I already told that password should be hashed. Right? So in order to hash this password, or you need to use some encryption mechanism, I need to register another bean. Another bean here, and that bean is a password encoder. Password encoder, we're gonna talk this one. So it's an interface. So this is a method name, and we need to return it's one of the implementation. So there are lots of implementation of this password encoder interface. One of them is no-ops password encoder. No-ops password encoder having the static method get instance, which will return its object. But as you see that is here what crossed here. So it is also deprecated, but it is not removed. Because no-ops password encoder का मतलब होता है कि आपका plain password ही है. आप बस उसे आप skip कर रहे हो, not using hashed password or encrypted password. So no-ops password encoder is similar like that you are using here what? In the previous example, with a default password encoder. Default password encoder basically is the no-ops password encoder, both are same. Right? मतलब जब आप यहाँ पे default password encoder use कर रहे हो, it also uses internally no-ops password encoder. Not's password encoder tells that it is not going to hash your password or encrypt your password before storing. It will just use your plain password. But you need to configure this bin explicitly in order to use this style of in-memory user detail management. Otherwise, your application will not work. Let's save this. This time I have a two user, admin user. Right? And now let's stop this one. I'll try to call this run this application once again. So my application got started. Let me call this endpoint once again, localhost. Say that welcome. Right now it is not logged out, so we can just do the logout first. Yes, it is logged out. And now localhost. Okay. This time sign in page, and here I'm using admin. 1, 2, 3, 4. This is not admin, I guess it is. With username 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The password is that. So admin password is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I hope everyone is comfortable with how to register multiple user. Of course, आप इस तरीके से कई सारे user को register कर सकते हो. But remember, those users will be stored as an in-memory user detail manager. In-memory user detail manager is a default user manager. जैसे कि आप ये default user details provide कर रहा है, आप you can configure a number of user details accordingly, and you can add that in a create user method passing this value. Tomorrow session we are going to see that how to deal with the database. That means अगर हमें database बनाना है तो क्या करना पड़ेगा? First of all, we should not rely over this in-memory user detail manager class. What we need to do, we need to write here our own custom implementation of this user detail service. So in-memory user details manager, JDBC user details manager, LDAP user details manager, these are the already implemented classes. हमने अभी इसका हमने use कर लिया था, right? You already implemented class, you can customize, you can add your user as well. But right now we are not relying on the already defined classes. We are going to define our own implementation of this user detail service. So that's what we are going to discuss on tomorrow's session. Before ending that, next class, we're also going to discuss about this different way to manage the password. What you will do that, just try to read this document. You'll get the idea. What is the difference between encoding and decoding, encryption, decryption, and hashing. Encoding, decoding, you need to just encode that plain text password and decode them. You'll get back again your old password. Encryption, decryption में क्या होता है? आपके पास एक secret key होता है. Based on that secret key, you need to just encode them, and only those people can get the original password, which they will have the particular key. But again, it will be the reversible. This option also is the reversible. But the hash password is the strong one, the strongest one. That means you need to use the hash function. Plain text password will be converted into the hash string. And that is a one way. You cannot reverse it back. आपको मैच करने के लिए दूसरा हैश पासवर्ड कंपेयर करोगे तभी आपका काम आएगा, लेकिन आप ओरिजिनल पासवर्ड को आप गेस नहीं कर पाओगे. That means you can't revert it back. You'll see that in much more detail. Some details is mentioned there. Please go through this and check out that from Google also. What is the difference between encoding, encryption, and hashing? This is also very, very important interview question. And how this password encoder is working there. So tomorrow will be much more fun because tomorrow we are not going to discuss too much theory part. Still, some people is not able to understand or confused between what authentication provider, authentication manager. Please read out everything and have explained it much more detailed way in this notes. Check out this and then go through this diagram, watch that video. Already, this notes is already shared with you. This Notion link is already shared with you. So in your LMS itself. So please refer that one. You'll get that idea. So that's it for the today's session. Thank you everyone for joining this session. Tomorrow will be much more fun because tomorrow database inspection will be there, and now things will be much more easy. Tomorrow we will discuss about the costs and CSR in detail once again, and then after we will see hopefully We can see some filters, how to apply the filters in JWT filter. Hopefully we will discuss on that. So thanks once again, and please provide your feedback, fill your feedback form. Zakir, over
Yes,
to
sir.
you. Let me stop the recording.
Yes, sir.